The last smoke I called in before everything changed was on August 14th. Azimuth 247, distance approximately 6 miles. Single column white transitioning to gray at the crown. Standard ground-to-crown progression in mixed conifer. I radioed Prescott Interagency Dispatch at 1423, got confirmation that engine 561 was en route, and went back to my 15-minute scan rotation. That fire was real. That fire behaved the way fires behave. I want to be clear about the difference, because after August 19th, I stopped being able to tell what was real by looking at it. My name is Mara Ellison. This was my 4th season staffing Kestrel Peak Lookout on the Ochoco National Forest in Central Oregon. Elevation 6,340 feet. Standard L4 cab 14 by 14 feet of glass and timber on a 41-foot treated timber tower with exterior staircase and wraparound catwalk. Osborne Firefinder bolted to the center pedestal. Two-way radio, VHF, Channel 3 for dispatch, Channel 7 for ground crews. Psychrometer, wind gauge, rain collector. Propane stove, cot, 3 shelves of field guides I'd read twice each. 1 pair of Swarovski binoculars my father gave me when I got the position. I love this job. I need you to understand that before anything else. 4 seasons I loved it. The silence, the enormity of it. The responsibility of being the first set of eyes between a dry forest and catastrophe. I was good at it. My detection rate was the highest in the district. 43 confirmed smokes in 4 years, average report to engine time of 19 minutes. I could distinguish dust from smoke at 11 miles. I could tell you whether a column was gaining or losing intensity by the color of its base. I knew what legitimate smoke looked like, and I knew what wasn't smoke. The thing in the trees was not smoke, but I'm getting ahead of myself. A typical day on Kestrel Peak started at 08:30. I'd climb the 67 steps, I counted them every morning, a small ritual unlock the hatch, and begin my opening routine. Weather observation first, dry bulb, wet bulb, calculate relative humidity, wind speed and direction from the anemometer, record everything in the logbook, radio dispatch with my readings, Prescott Dispatch, Kestrel Peak Lookout, in service, 900, weather follows. Then I'd give them the numbers and they'd click twice on the mic to acknowledge. After that, the day was mine in 15-minute increments. Scan the full 360 degrees with binoculars. Check each drainage, each ridgeline, each south-facing slope where fuel loads were heaviest. Between scans, I read. I sketched. I watched the weather build over the Cascades to the west and counted the seconds between lightning and thunder when storms rolled through. On busy days, I might call in 5 or 6 smokes. On quiet days, nothing but the creak of the tower in wind and the occasional raven arguing with itself below me. The Ochoco is not a dramatic landscape. It's not the jagged Cascades or the painted desert further south. It's rolling, quiet, ponderosa country, open stands with bunchgrass understory, rocky ridges breaking through like the spine of something ancient. Juniper at the lower elevations, mountain mahogany in the draws. The forest here has a particular smell in August, sun-baked pine resin and dust and something mineral rising from the volcanic soil. The light turns everything golden by late afternoon, and at night the stars are so dense they seem to weigh on you. I worked alone. That was the point. That was what I chose. My nearest neighbor was Dave Kowalski at Lookout Mountain, 11 miles northeast. We shared a repeater frequency and sometimes talked in the evenings after going off service weather gossip, mostly, or complaints about pack rats getting into our propane lines. Beyond Dave, the closest human presence was the Paulina Ranger Station, 34 miles by Forest Road. I had a 4-wheel drive truck parked at the trailhead 2 miles below, and I hiked in supplies every 10 days. The rest of the time it was just me, the tower, and roughly 180,000 acres of visible forest. I tell you this because when I say something was in the trees, You need to understand how well I knew those trees. I had stared at every visible acre from that cab for 4 fire seasons. I knew how the canopy moved in different wind conditions. I knew which groves cast shadows at what hour. I knew the specific shapes of the trees closest to my tower, the ones within a quarter-mile that formed my immediate visual perimeter, as well as I knew the furniture in my apartment back in Bend during the off-season. Better. August 19th was a Tuesday. Lightning had rolled through Sunday night. 247 recorded strikes within the district, and I'd been in a detection posture since Monday morning, watching for holdover fires. That's what happens after dry lightning. The strike starts a small smolder in duff or a punky log, and it can hold for 72 hours before conditions align, and it crowns. Monday, I'd called in 2 holdovers, both confirmed. By Tuesday afternoon, the initial attack teams had them lined and mopped up. Dispatch radioed their thanks. I made dinner, instant rice, and canned chili, and stepped onto the catwalk for my evening scan. The sun was about 40 minutes from setting. The light was that thick amber that makes the ponderosa bark glow almost red. I swept my binoculars west to east along the ridgeline called Hall's Rim, about 1.5 miles out. This was routine. I had done this scan approximately 2,000 times across 4 seasons. There was something standing in the canopy, not below the canopy, not among the trunks, in the canopy, at crown height, roughly 80 to 90 feet up. It was not in any single tree. It occupied a space between 3 ponderosas where their crowns almost touched. And it was, I have to be careful with this word, it was still. Not motionless the way an animal freezes when spotted. Still the way a rock formation is still, the way something is still that has never moved. Except I had scanned that exact ridgeline at 17:15, 40 minutes earlier, and it was not there. Through the binoculars it registered as a dark vertical shape, perhaps 12 feet tall, with a width I couldn't determine because it seemed to vary depending on how long I looked. The color was wrong for a shadow too opaque, too defined at the edges. But it wasn't solid in the way a physical object is solid. There was no obvious surface, no texture I could resolve. It was like looking at a gap in the image, a place where the trees behind it simply weren't being rendered. I put down the binoculars. I could still see it with my naked eyes, barely, a slight wrongness on the ridgeline, easy to dismiss as a trick of evening light. I raised the binoculars again. Still there, same position, same shape. Not moving. I watched it for 11 minutes. I know this because I noted the time, 17:56, and when I finally looked away to blink and rest my eyes and then looked back, it was 18:07 and the shape was gone. The ridgeline looked exactly as it always had. 3 ponderosas with a gap between their crowns where evening sky showed through. I wrote in my log, 17:56 to 18:07. Unusual visual phenomenon. Hall's Rim approximately bearing 283. Dark vertical shape at canopy height. Duration approximately 11 minutes. No smoke associated. Possible thermal mirage or shadow artifact. Clear by 18:07. I did not radio dispatch. What would I have said? I saw a shape in the trees that I can't explain. They would have asked if it was smoke. I would have said no. End of useful conversation. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tower makes noises at night. Thermal contraction of the timber frame, the occasional bump of a flying squirrel on the roof, wind gusting against the glass. But I lay there listening to those familiar sounds and feeling, for the first time in 4 seasons, like the darkness outside my windows was paying attention to me rather than the other way around. Wednesday the 20th was clear and hot. I did my weather OBs: dry bulb 84, wet bulb 62, humidity 22%, wind southwest at 8. I reported to dispatch normally. I did my scans. I looked at Hall's Rim probably 30 times that day. Nothing, just trees being trees. Thursday, nothing. Friday the 22nd. I was doing my 1100 scan mid-morning, full sun, no possible shadow ambiguity, and I found it again. Not on Hall's rim this time. South-southeast, bearing 168, much closer, approximately half a mile. Same shape, same impossible position in the crowns. Same 12-foot vertical darkness with undefined edges. This time I used the Osborne Firefinder. I lined the crosshairs up and recorded the bearing precisely. 168.5 degrees. I estimated elevation angle and referenced my topographic map. The position corresponded to a small knoll I knew I'd hiked past it dozens of times on my supply trips. Old-growth ponderosa, some of the biggest trees in my visible area. 300-year-old giants with canopies that started 50 feet off the ground. The thing was up there, in the canopy, at approximately 70 feet, in full daylight, stationary. I watched it for 23 minutes this time, and during those 23 minutes I began to notice something I hadn't registered before. The trees immediately adjacent to the shape were not moving. The wind was blowing. I could see canopy movement everywhere else on that hillside. But the 4 or 5 trees closest to the shape had gone perfectly still. Their needles, their branches, nothing moved, as though the air in that specific zone had been switched off. At 11:24, I looked away to write a note, and when I looked back, it was gone. The trees were swaying normally again. I radioed Dave Kowalski. Not on the dispatch channel on our private frequency. I said, "Dave, you seeing anything unusual in your visible area? Any weird shapes or shadows in the canopy?" Long pause, then. "What kind of shapes?" "Tall, dark, stationary, up at crown height, visible for 20 minutes or so and then gone." Another pause, longer. "No, I'm not seeing anything like that. You feeling okay, Mara?" "I'm fine, probably just heat shimmer. Thanks." "Okay, you know where I am if you need to talk." Dave's concern was reasonable. Isolation does things to people. Kerouac famously couldn't handle a single summer on a lookout. Every season there are stories about people who start seeing things in the trees, human shapes in the snags, faces in the bark. The brain wants to find patterns, especially when you spend 10 hours a day staring at visual monotony. I knew this. I had trained myself over 4 years to distrust my pattern recognition, to second-guess my eyes, to never call in a smoke I wasn't at least 80% confident about. But I was 100% confident about what I was seeing, and I was scared in a way I didn't know what to do with, because nothing about it was aggressive. It just stood there. It watched. Over the next 4 days, I saw it 6 more times, never in the same location twice. The bearing shifted. 283, 168, 041, 312, 097, 224. Circling my tower at distances between half a mile and 2 miles. Always in the canopy, always stationary, always accompanied by that stillness in the adjacent trees. Duration varied, 11 minutes, 23, 7, 31, 9, 14. I logged every appearance with time, bearing, duration, and conditions. I started plotting the positions on my topographic map. They formed an irregular ring around my tower. On August 26th, it appeared at bearing 315, distance approximately 400 yards. Close enough that through the binoculars I could see individual branches behind it, or rather I could see where branches should have been and were somehow obscured. The shape was clearer at this distance. It was not quite symmetrical. The upper portion was slightly wider than I'd first estimated, and there was something about the edges, a granular quality, like static on an untuned television. The longer I looked, the more my eyes wanted to slide off it, as if the shape was exerting some kind of visual repulsion. And for the first time, I became aware that the thing was oriented. It had a facing, and it was facing my tower. I set down my binoculars and stood perfectly still in the center of the cab. Through the glass I could see it without magnification, now a dark, upright smear among the green crowns. I had the sudden, lurching certainty that it could see me too, that it had always been able to see me, that seeing me was the entire point. I picked up the radio. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. Then I put it down. What I did instead was call my sister in Bend. I used my satellite phone, which was technically for emergencies only. I told her I was having a weird week and asked her to look something up for me. Historical records for Kestrel Peak Lookout, any notes from previous staffers about unusual sightings. She thought I was being strange, but said she'd ask around. That night I did something I'd never done in 4 seasons. I closed the shutters. All of them. Every window. I sat in the closed cab with my headlamp on and listened to the forest. Wind in the canopy. The pulse of crickets. An owl somewhere east. Normal sounds. Normal night. But at approximately 02:30, the crickets stopped. All of them simultaneously, in every direction. The silence was so sudden and total that it felt like pressure, like being submerged. It lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Then the crickets resumed, but unevenly, starting far away and rolling back toward the tower, like a wave returning to shore. I did not open the shutters. August the 27th. My sister called back. She'd spoken to a retired ranger in Preenville who'd worked the Ochoco in the 1990s. He told her that Kestrel Peak had a staffing problem, his words, for about a decade between 1987 and 1997. The Forest Service had trouble keeping anyone in the tower for a full season. 3 lookouts quit mid-contract. 1 had to be evacuated by helicopter after a psychological episode. The specifics weren't in any file she could access, but the retired ranger said the rumor was always the same. They saw something in the trees and couldn't stop seeing it. The tower was unstaffed from 1997 to 2006. When the Forest Service resumed operations there, it was with seasonal staffers on shorter rotations, 12 days on, 4 off, rather than the previous format of month-long postings. I'd always assumed that was a staffing modernization. Now I wasn't sure. I asked my sister to dig deeper. She said I sounded scared and asked if I wanted to come down. I told her no. I told her I was fine. I was not fine. But I also wasn't ready to leave, because something had shifted in me, something beyond fear. The shape in the trees was watching me, yes, but I had also been watching it. For 8 days I had been logging its appearances with the same discipline I applied to smoke detection. I had bearings, durations, conditions, distances. I had data, and the data was telling me something. It was getting closer. Not steadily, the pattern wasn't a simple inward spiral, but the average distance was decreasing. First sighting, 1.5 miles. Most recent, 400 yards. And the durations were increasing. 7 minutes to 31 minutes. It was spending more time visible, more time watching. On August 29th, I filed my regular 10-day supply hike. I drove to Paulina and bought groceries and propane and sat in the parking lot of the ranger station for 20 minutes, trying to decide whether to go inside and tell someone. Tell them what? That I was seeing a shape in the trees. That previous lookouts had seen it too. That it was getting closer. I went inside. I asked to speak with the district ranger. I was told she was in Bend for meetings. I spoke instead to a fire management officer named Gutierrez. I told him I was seeing an unusual persistent visual phenomenon from my tower and asked if there were any environmental explanations, atmospheric inversions, unusual wildlife, anything. Gutierrez frowned. He said he'd never heard of anything like that. He asked if I wanted to be relieved. I said no. He offered to send someone up to check on me in a few days. I said that would be fine. I drove back, hiked in my supplies, climbed the 67 stairs, unlocked the hatch, scanned the trees. Nothing. For 3 days, August 30th, 31st, September 1st, nothing. I did my scans every 15 minutes, I searched every bearing where it had appeared before. Clear, normal. Trees swaying in the wind. I started to feel something worse than fear. I felt foolish. I started to wonder if Dave was right. If the heat and the isolation and the lightning watch exhaustion had done something to my perception. If I'd logged a hallucination with the same rigor I logged smoke, and the rigor itself had made it feel real. September 2nd, Gutierrez drove up with a seasonal tech named Pham. They climbed the tower, admired the view, checked my equipment. Everything was functioning normally. Gutierrez asked if I was still seeing things. I said no, it had resolved. He seemed relieved. They stayed for an hour, had coffee, and left. I watched their truck disappear down the forest road. And then I did my next scan. It was there, bearing 022, distance approximately 200 yards, not in the canopy this time. Lower. Mid-trunk height, maybe 30 feet off the ground, pressed against the trunk of a large ponderosa, oriented toward the tower. It was the closest it had ever been, and I could see more of it now. At 200 yards through Swarovski glass, I could resolve details I'd missed at greater distances. The shape had structure. The upper portion was not merely wider, it was branched, forked into 3 or 4 irregular extensions that curved upward, like a hand opening. The main body was narrower than I'd estimated, perhaps 3 feet wide, but the height was correct. 12 feet, maybe 13. The edges still had that static quality, that visual repulsion, but through it I could now see that the surface, if it was a surface, was not uniform. It had depth, layers, like looking into dark water where you can sense the bottom is far below but cannot see it. And from the lower portion, where it pressed against the bark, I could see the bark was different. Darkened, not burned, not diseased. Darkened as though something was being drawn out of it. The sapwood visible where bark had sloughed away was grey instead of the living cream white it should have been. The needles on that tree, and only that tree, were hanging limp and greyed, as though something had pulled the colour from them. I was looking at this when my radio crackled. Kestrel Peak, Prescott Dispatch. I keyed the mic without taking my eyes off the binoculars. Prescott Dispatch, Kestrel Peak, go ahead. Kestrel, we're showing a weather alert for your area. Red flag conditions expected tomorrow through Friday. Winds gusting to 35, humidity dropping to single digits. Please confirm your readiness and report any holdover activity from the August 23rd lightning. Copy, dispatch. Kestrel is ready. No active holdovers in my visible area. I'll increase scan frequency. Roger, Kestrel. Appreciate it. Dispatch clear. I set down the mic, looked through the binoculars again. The shape was gone. The tree it had been pressed against was visible. Same ponderosa. Same trunk, but the bark looked normal. Needles green. No discoloration. I climbed down from the tower for the first time in 3 days. Took my GPS and my camera and hiked to bearing 022, 200 yards. Found the tree. It was a healthy ponderosa, 18 inches diameter, bark intact, crown full. No dead needles, no grey sapwood, no evidence of anything having touched it, but at the base of the tree, and I photographed this, the duff was compressed in a circular pattern roughly 4 feet across. Not footprints, not animal bedding, just a smooth, even compression, as though something heavy had rested there for a long time. And within that compression, the pine needles were bleached white, not brown the way decomposition turns them. White, as though every pigment molecule had been removed. I hiked back to the tower. That evening, I uploaded the photographs to my laptop and studied them. The bleached circle was unambiguous. Something real had been at that tree. Something that left a physical trace. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because I was making a decision. I could leave. I could radio dispatch in the morning, tell them I was having a personal emergency, drive to Bend, and never come back. Gutierrez would staff a replacement. The Ochoco would still get watched for smoke. No one would blame me. Or I could stay, and I could learn what this was. I understand how that sounds. The horror story protagonist who doesn't leave. But you need to understand my position. I was not a character in a story. I was a professional with 4 seasons of experience and a phenomenon I could document. The shape had never moved toward me while I was watching it. It had never made a threatening gesture. It had never appeared inside my perimeter, only in the trees. And it was clearly, demonstrably real in some physical sense because it left traces on the ground. I chose to stay, but I also chose to change my approach. On September 3rd, instead of passively scanning, I began active observation protocols. I mounted my camera on a tripod next to the Osborne firefinder, pointed at the most recent bearing. I set it to capture a frame every 30 seconds. I kept my binoculars trained on the near perimeter, anything within 500 yards, and I stopped looking away. If the thing appeared and disappeared only when I broke observation, I wanted to know whether that was a hard rule or a tendency. At 10:34, the time-lapse camera captured something. Frame 847 showed normal forest. Frame 848, 30 seconds later, showed the shape. It had appeared at bearing 340, approximately 300 yards, in the canopy. It was facing the tower. It was there for 6 frames, 3 minutes. And then between frame 853 and frame 854, it was gone. But here is the critical thing. I was watching bearing 340 continuously during those 3 minutes. I saw it appear, I saw it remain, and I saw it leave. It did not vanish. It moved. Faster than my eyes could track, but directionally. It went up, straight up, through the canopy and into the sky, and it was gone. Not dissolved, departed. This changed everything. Whatever the shape was, it wasn't a hallucination or a mirage or a shadow artifact. It was a thing that arrived from somewhere and departed upward. It had agency. It chose when to appear and when to leave, and the fact that it went up, not into the ground, not laterally into deeper forest, but up, meant it came from above. I started looking at the sky differently. Central Oregon skies in September are enormous. You can see weather systems 100 miles away. The blue is so deep during the day it looks purple near the zenith. And at night, without light pollution, the Milky Way throws enough light to cast faint shadows. I had stared at this sky for 4 years and found it beautiful and empty. Now I watched it with suspicion. September 4th through 7th. Red flag conditions. Wind hammered the tower. I called in 3 new starts on the 5th. All lightning holdovers finally waking up in the wind. Engine crews were stretched thin. I was busy, genuinely, productively busy, and for those 4 days the shape did not appear. I was grateful for the reprieve, but couldn't shake the thought that it was waiting for me to be unoccupied again, as though my attention was what it wanted, and it wouldn't compete for it. September 8th. Winds died. Humidity recovered slightly. The fires were contained. I went back to normal scan rotation, and that afternoon, at 15:48, the shape appeared. Bearing 180. Due south. Distance, 112 yards. I measured it against known landmarks, the closest it had ever been. It was at ground level this time, not in the canopy, not mid-trunk, but standing in a gap between trees on the forest floor. Full height visible, 12 to 13 feet, those branching upper extensions fully spread, oriented toward me. And for the first time, I heard something. Not sound exactly, not with my ears. A pressure, a subsonic thrum that I felt in my sternum and in my teeth, like standing too close to a large speaker playing a frequency below human hearing. It wasn't painful. It wasn't unpleasant. But it was there, and it corresponded to the shape's presence. And when the shape departed upward again, that impossible speed, the pressure stopped instantly. I sat down on the floor of the cab. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from the adrenaline of contact, because that's what this was, wasn't it? The approaches, the decreasing distance, the increasing duration, it was an approach. Something was approaching me, and it was doing so with what I could only interpret as caution. Patience. It stopped when I was busy. It departed when I was frightened. It came closer only incrementally over weeks. Whatever intelligence it possessed, it was using that intelligence to manage my fear, which meant it wanted something, and it didn't want me to run before it could communicate what that was. September 9th. I made a decision that I still don't know was right. I went on to the catwalk at dusk. I stood at the railing facing south the last bearing. I did not use binoculars. I simply stood and waited, visible, unmoving. I was offering myself as a subject of observation the same way it had offered itself to me. For 40 minutes, nothing. The forest dimmed. Venus appeared. Bats started working the airspace around the tower. Then the crickets stopped. The silence pressed in from every direction, that same totality I'd experienced on the night of August 26th. And in the silence, I felt the pressure return, the subsonic thrum in my chest. Stronger now, I could feel it in my kneecaps, in the back of my skull. I looked south. In the near darkness, perhaps 80 yards from the base of my tower, I could see it. Not the shape I'd been watching through binoculars, the full presence. Without magnification, at this distance, in this light, I could perceive what the daytime observations hadn't revealed. It was not a single shape. It was a density, a region of space where something was concentrated so thoroughly that light couldn't pass through, but around that central density, at the margins, there was movement. Slow, rotational movement. Like a cloud of something orbiting a core too dark to see. It stood among the trees at the edge of my clearing, 80 yards away, and the trees around it were absolutely still. I stayed on the catwalk. I did not go inside. I gripped the railing and I looked at it, and it looked at me, and neither of us moved. 3 minutes. 5. The pressure increased, not painfully, but I could feel my breathing entraining to something. A rhythm that wasn't mine. My exhales were lengthening, my inhales shortening. I was being synchronized with a frequency I couldn't hear. I spoke. Out loud. I said, "I can see you." Nothing changed. The shape remained. The pressure remained. My breathing continued its slow recalibration. I said, "I've been watching you for 3 weeks." The upper portion of the shape, those branching extensions, moved. They drew inward, toward the center, and then opened again, slowly, deliberately, like a gesture, like an acknowledgement. Then it left, upward. That speed, gone. The crickets returned. I went inside. I sat on my cot. I was breathing normally again. My heart rate was elevated, but not racing. I felt, and this is the part I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since I felt recognized. Not threatened, not hunted, recognized, as though something that had been watching me for a long time had finally confirmed that I could see it back, and that confirmation satisfied something. I slept well that night. Better than I had in weeks. I don't know what to make of that. September the 10th through 14th. The shape appeared every day. Always south, always between 80 and 100 yards, always at dusk. Duration increased steadily. 20 minutes, then 35, then 41, then 53, then 1 hour and 7 minutes. I stopped experiencing the subsonic pressure as alien. It became familiar, like the background hum of the tower in wind. I stopped timing the cricket silence. I stopped gripping the railing. On the 14th, during its hour-long appearance, I saw a second shape. It was at the same distance, roughly 40 yards east of the first, and it was smaller, perhaps 8 feet tall. Same visual characteristics, the dark density, the static edges, the slow peripheral movement. But its upper extensions were proportionally larger, and they were oriented not toward me, but toward the first shape. It appeared to be facing its companion rather than me. A third appeared on September the 15th, then a fourth. By September 18th, I was counting 7 of them in the trees south of my tower every evening, and the trees they stood among were dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but I could see it now. The progressive graying I'd noticed on that single ponderosa in early September was spreading. A cluster of trees in the south perimeter, roughly corresponding to the shape's regular positions, was losing color. Needles fading from green to olive to gray, bark darkening. The understory beneath them, normally bunchgrass and lupine, was flattened and bleached in those same perfect circles I'd photographed weeks ago. I radioed Dave Kowalski on September 19th. I said, "Dave, I need you to do something for me. I need you to point your glass at my tower and tell me what you see in the tree line to my south." Long silence, then, "Mara, what's going on? Just look, please." I waited. 3 minutes, then, "I'm looking. I can see your tower. Tree line south of you looks—" "I don't know, Mara. Some of those ponderosas look stressed. You might be getting some beetle kill starting." "Can you see anything else? Anything unusual? Any shapes?" "No, just trees. Some of them look like they need rain. You sure you're okay up there?" He couldn't see them. From 11 miles, through good optics, he could see the dying trees, but not what was killing them, which meant either the shapes weren't visible at that distance, or they weren't visible to him. September the 20th. I was scheduled for my rotation break 4 days off. I was supposed to hike down, drive to Bend, do laundry, buy groceries, sleep in a real bed. Instead, I radioed dispatch and requested to stay on station through the break. The FMO approved it. Red flag conditions were returning, and having continuous coverage was valuable. But that wasn't why I stayed. I stayed because the shapes were now appearing in the morning too, and at midday. And through the night, I'd started leaving the shutters open, and I could see their darker-than-dark forms in the moonlight, 7 of them arranged in a loose semicircle south of the tower, stationary for hours. I was watching them, and they were watching me, and I didn't want to break the continuity of it. This is where I need to be honest about something. I was not being controlled. My thoughts were clear. My professional duties continued. I did my scans. I filed my weather observations. I called in a smoke on the 21st, confirmed. Engine 487 suppressed it by nightfall. I was eating, sleeping, functioning. But my priorities had shifted in a way I couldn't fully justify to anyone else. The shapes had become the primary object of my attention, and everything else, the job, the routine, the normal world, had become background. I recognized this. I recognized it as potentially dangerous. And I stayed anyway. September the 23rd. The 7th shape was closer than the others. It had moved forward from the semicircle 70 yards, 60, then 50. By afternoon, it was 40 yards from the base of my tower, close enough that I could have hit it with a thrown rock. And at 40 yards, in full daylight, I could see something new. It was translucent at the margins, not opaque all the way through. The outer edges allowed some light to pass, and that light was shifted, reddened, the way sunlight reddens passing through smoke. Within that translucent border, I could see structure, not anatomy, not organs or limbs, but geometry, angles that repeated, patterns that folded inward on themselves. The interior of the shape was organized, and the organization was complex in a way that reminded me of nothing natural I'd ever seen. And the tree it stood beside, a ponderosa I'd known for 4 years, a healthy tree I'd used as a bearing landmark, was dead. Completely dead. grey from root to crown, no needles remaining, bark sloughing in sheets. It had died in under a week. That night, I did something I cannot fully explain. I climbed down from the tower, at 2200, in full darkness with only my headlamp. I walked south across the clearing toward the semicircle. I could feel the pressure increasing with every step, that subsonic rhythm thickening in my bones. At 30 yards, I could see them without the headlamp. They were self-evident in the darkness. 7 pillars of deeper black against the merely dark forest. The closest one, the one that had advanced, was directly ahead. I stopped at 20 yards. I could feel my breathing trying to synchronize again. I resisted this time. I breathed deliberately, at my own rhythm, counting 4 in, 7 out, keeping my cadence. The closest shape responded. Its upper extensions opened. That slow spread I'd seen before, and from between them, something fell, not dropped, lowered, drifted down like a leaf in still air, a small object that landed in the bleached duff between us. I waited 60 seconds. The shape did not move. I walked forward, collected the object, and walked back to the tower. In the light of my headlamp, sitting on my cot with the hatch locked, I examined it. It was a piece of bark. Ponderosa bark. I'd know that jigsaw puzzle texture anywhere. But it was not from any tree near here. It was old, weathered smooth on the outer surface, and on the inner surface, the cambium side, there were marks, not carved, not burned, impressed, as though something had pressed against the soft inner bark with enough force to leave an imprint, and then the bark had dried around that impression. The marks were arranged in a pattern, 3 concentric circles, the innermost very small, the outermost perhaps 4 inches across. Between the circles, short radial lines like the markings on the Osborne firefinder's graduated ring, like a compass rose, and at the center, a dot. I knew what it was. I'd stared at an identical image every day for 4 years. It was a diagram of the view from my tower. The circles were distance rings, the radial lines were bearings, and the dot in the center was me. They had made a map that said, "We know what you do here. We know you watch. We have learned watching from you." I sat with that bark in my hands for a long time. The next morning, September 24th, I radioed dispatch and requested relief. I told them I was experiencing fatigue and needed to come down early. The FMO understood. A replacement, a retired lookout named Harlan. Something would be up in 2 days. I spent those 2 days watching. The shapes were visible constantly now, not just south all round. I counted 19 before I stopped counting. They stood in the trees at all distances, from 40 yards to the edge of visibility. Some were in the canopy. Some were at ground level. The smaller ones, 8 feet, 6 feet, even smaller, were more numerous than the tall originals. And the ring of dead trees was spreading. I could see gray crowns in every direction, but they never came into the clearing. They never touched the tower. They never crossed whatever boundary existed between the trees and the open ground around the structure. And on the last night, when I stood on the catwalk and looked out at 19 shapes watching me from the ring of dying forest, I felt the pressure settle into my chest with a new quality. Not observation. Not recognition. Gratitude. I cannot prove that. I cannot explain how a subsonic vibration carries emotional content. But I felt it the way you feel when someone across a room catches your eye and nods. An acknowledgement. A thank you. For weeks of not running, for weeks of watching back. Harlan arrived on September the 26th. I briefed him on the standard rotation weather OBs, scan protocol, dispatch frequencies. I did not tell him about the shapes. I did not tell him about the dead trees. I told him the south perimeter was showing some beetle kill and to keep an eye on it. He nodded. He seemed like a steady man. 50s. Calm. I hiked out. I drove to Bend. I showered. I slept 14 hours. 3 days later, I called the ranger station and asked how Harlan was settling in. Gutierrez said he was fine. No issues. Any unusual reports? I asked. Like what? Anything about the trees, the beetle kill. Oh yeah, he mentioned that. Said it's spreading faster than he'd expect. We've got an entomologist scheduled to go up next month. Has he mentioned seeing anything else? Anything unusual? No, he seems happy up there. Good fit. I hung up. I sat in my apartment in Bend and looked at the piece of bark on my desk, the compass rose, the dot in the center. 2 weeks later, I called back. Different person answered someone new on the desk. I asked about Kestrel Peak. That tower, it's unstaffed. What do you mean? There's a lookout there. Harlan. He left, week and a half ago. Just radioed one morning and said he was coming down. Didn't give a reason. FMO said he looked fine when he got back, just said it wasn't for him. I drove to Paulina the next day. I asked to see the tower log. Gutierrez let me look. Harlan's entries were normal for the first 6 days. Weather, scan rotations, one smoke called in. Then on day 7, October the 2nd, a single entry. Shapes in the trees, numerous, watching, departed 1847. Day 8. Shapes present from 0600, closer, south perimeter, trees dying, request relief. No entries after that. I turned back through the log to my own entries. Everything I'd written was there. The bearings, the durations, the careful clinical notes. And then I noticed something I'd missed when I was writing them. Something that only became visible reading them sequentially from outside. My first sighting was August 19th. One shape, my last was September the 25th. 19 shapes. Harlan's first sighting was October the 2nd, 7 days after he arrived. Already numerous. The interval between my arrival and first sighting, 73 days. The interval between Harlan's arrival and first sighting, 7 days. They were getting faster. Each time a new person climbed that tower and started watching, the shapes learned to show themselves sooner. My 4 years of patient observation, my scans, my logging, my professional watching had taught them something about being seen. And now they were applying that lesson more efficiently with each new observer. I had not been a witness. I had been a teacher. I put down the logbook. I asked Gutierrez whether they planned to restaff the tower. He said yes, probably next spring. I asked him to reconsider. He asked me why. I told him everything. The shapes, the dead trees, the subsonic pressure, the bark with the compass rose, the pattern of decreasing contact intervals. I told him I believed something was using the tower, using the act of looking at to calibrate itself to human perception, to learn how to be seen by us, and that each successful observation made the next one easier, faster, closer. Gutierrez listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he said, "You think it wants?" I said, "I think it wants to come out of the trees." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The tower's been there since 1952. You're not the first person to report things like this." I know. The staffing gap in the 90s. Before that, too. Goes back decades. Every few years, someone sees something and leaves. Then we restaff, and it's quiet for a while. "It's not going to be quiet anymore," I said. "The intervals are compressing. Whoever you put up there next will see them within days, maybe hours." Gutierrez looked at me. Then he said something I think about every day. "What if we don't put anyone up there?" And I understood what he was asking. If the shapes needed an observer, if the looking itself was what drew them out of whatever space they normally occupied, then an unstaffed tower was a closed door. No one watching meant nothing to watch. The circle breaks. But then I thought about the 19 shapes I'd seen on my last night. The ring of dead trees expanding in every direction, the smaller shapes, 6 feet, 4 feet multiplying. The compass rose that said, "We have learned watching from you." And I said, "I think they already know how. I think they don't need us to look anymore. I think we just taught them that they can be seen, and now they're gone." I drove back to Bend. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't been back to the Ochoco. But last Tuesday, driving east on Highway 20 toward Burns, I passed through a stretch of National Forest, different district, different drainage, 40 miles from Kestrel Peak. And in the trees along the highway, for maybe 2 seconds at 60 miles per hour, I saw shape. Tall, dark, stationary in the canopy, facing the road, facing the cars, learning to be seen by everyone who passes. And don't scan for smoke anymore. But I can't stop scanning, and every tree line I pass, every dark gap between crowns, every shadow that holds still when the wind should move it. I look. I look because they taught me to, and I taught them to be there when I did. The piece of bark is still on my desk. The compass rose with the dot in the center. But I've started to think the diagram isn't a map of the view from the tower. I think it's a map of something else. I think the circles are thresholds. I think the radial lines are directions of expansion. And I think the dot in the center isn't me. It's where they're all converging. I just don't know where center is yet. And every day, I don't know, they get one day closer to showing me. That was what I believed 3 weeks ago, that the not knowing was temporary, that the convergence point was somewhere out there in the forest, some specific coordinate where the shapes were gathering, and my only role going forward was to wonder about it from a safe distance in Bend. I was wrong about the distance being safe. I was wrong about a lot of things. October 18th, a Friday. I was at the grocery store on Galveston Avenue, a place I've shopped for 6 years, standing in the produce section choosing avocados, and I felt the pressure, that subsonic thrum, faint, barely there, like hearing a familiar song from 3 rooms away. I set down the avocado and stood completely still. Around me, people were shopping normally. Music playing from the ceiling speakers, the refrigeration units humming. No one else reacted. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then it was gone. I left without buying anything. Sat in my car for 20 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. Told myself it was psychosomatic. Told myself the body remembers trauma and generates phantom sensations. Told myself I was fine. October 21st, Monday. I was running on the Deschutes River Trail, something I do 3 mornings a week in the off-season. Usually at 6:30 before the path gets crowded. The trail passes through a corridor of ponderosa along the river. I'd run this section probably 200 times. That morning, at mile marker 3.4, I felt the pressure again. Stronger. Not imagined I could feel it in my molars, the way you feel a bass note in a car with the windows up. I stopped running, looked into the trees along the trail. Ponderosa, juniper, some mountain mahogany in the understory. Normal. No shapes, no stillness in the canopy. Just ordinary forest in early morning light. But at the base of one ponderosa, about 15 feet off the trail, I could see a circle of bleached duff. White pine needles in a perfect 4-foot ring. I walked to it, knelt, pressed my palm against the compressed ground. It was warm. Not sun-warm, the tree was shading it, but warm from below. Like residual body heat. Like something had been resting there recently and had just left. I looked up into the canopy above me. Nothing. Branches, sky, a Stellar's jay watching me with that aggressive curiosity they have. Normal. But the pressure remained. Constant, low-grade, barely perceptible, unless I held my breath and listened with my bones, and it did not stop when I left the circle. It continued as I walked back to the trail. It continued as I jogged to my car. It continued as I drove home. It has not stopped since. I want to be precise about this. It's not painful. It's not debilitating. Most of the time I can ignore it the way you ignore the hum of a refrigerator. But it's there, a bass note beneath everything, a vibration in the substrate of my daily life that tells me something is nearby. Always nearby, never visible, but present. October the 23rd. I called my sister. She came over that evening and I told her everything, not the edited version I'd given her in September, but everything. The shapes, the dead trees, the bark compass rose, Harlan leaving after 7 days, Gutierrez's decades of identical reports. She listened without interrupting, which is not like her. When I finished, she asked me the same question Gutierrez had asked. What do you think it wants? And I gave her a different answer than I'd given him. Because 3 weeks of the pressure, 3 weeks of feeling observed without seeing an observer, had changed my interpretation. On the mountain, I'd thought the shapes wanted to come out of the trees. I'd thought they were learning to be seen by humans, and maybe that's still true. But what I think now is something worse. I think they already came out of the trees. I think they're already here, in Bend, in the Ponderosa along the river trail, in the junipers along the highway, in every stand of timber within every town built into the margins of the Ochoco, the Deschutes, the Cascades. And the reason no one is seeing them is that they learned from me from my weeks of careful, patient observation exactly how to stand at the threshold of perception, exactly how close they can be without triggering alarm, exactly how long they can remain without being noticed. I taught them the parameters of human attention, and now they're using that knowledge to stay just outside it. My sister was quiet for a long time after I said this. Then she said, "Mara, you need to talk to someone." "I'm talking to you. I mean a professional, someone who can help you figure out whether this is—" She stopped herself. "Whether I'm having a break." I said it for her. Whether the isolation did something to my brain and I'm generating this from the inside. I didn't say that. You don't have to, but I have photographs. I have the bark. I have log entries corroborated by Harlan's independent observations. I have Gutierrez confirming decades of identical reports from the same tower. This isn't a delusion, Nadia. It's a pattern. She left that night. I could tell she was worried, and I could tell she didn't know which possibility frightened her more, that I was right or that I wasn't. October 27th. I drove back to the Deschutes River Trail. Not to run, to look. I parked at the trailhead at 0600, before dawn, before other users. I brought my binoculars and my camera. I walked to mile marker 3.4 and found the bleached circle. It was still there. The warm ground had cooled, but the white needles remained, and I noticed now that there was a second circle about 20 feet further from the trail, partially obscured by a juniper, and a third beyond that, barely visible in the dawn light. A line of them, leading away from the trail, deeper into the timber. I followed. Each circle was spaced roughly 20 feet from the last. Perfect compression, perfect bleaching. Whatever made them had rested at each point for some duration and then moved to the next, like stations, like a path marked by pauses. The seventh circle was at the base of a large ponderosa that I recognized not from the trail, but from my Kestrel Peak observations. This was impossible. I was in Bend, 34 miles from my tower, but the feeling of recognition was absolute. Something about the proportions of the trunk, the angle of the lowest branch, the spiral of the bark plates. I had seen this tree through binoculars. I was certain, except I couldn't have. The distances didn't work. This tree was here, along the Deschutes, where it had presumably stood for 2 centuries. It could not also be visible from Kestrel Peak at 6,000 feet and 40 miles away. I took out my GPS and marked the coordinates. Then I went home and pulled up the bearing log for my tower observations. Bearing 168.5, the second sighting September the 22nd. I cross-referenced the coordinates on my topographic map. They matched. The GPS location of this tree and bend was 44.0581 degrees north, 121.3167 degrees west. The position I'd recorded from the Osborne Firefinder at bearing 168.5, calculated for a distance of approximately half a mile from Kestrel Peak, was 44.0579 degrees north, 121.3171 degrees west, 4 meters apart, within the margin of GPS error. But Kestrel Peak is at 44.341 degrees north, 120.804 degrees west, 34 miles northeast. The bearing of 168.5 from that position, at a distance of half a mile, should correspond to a location in deep forest near Hall's Rim. Not here, not in Bend. Unless distance meant something different to them. Unless the bleached circles weren't pauses in a linear path, but stations in a geometry I couldn't map with normal instruments. Unless what I'd been observing from the tower, those shapes at various bearings and distances, weren't scattered across the physical forest at all. Unless they were all in the same place, and the compass rose on the bark wasn't showing me their spread. It was showing me how a single location connects to many points simultaneously. The dot in the center isn't a destination they're converging on, it's a position they already occupy. One position, present everywhere at once, and the circles, the thresholds on the bark diagram, aren't distances. They're degrees of visibility, how much of themselves they allow to be seen. I was never watching multiple shapes learning to approach. I was watching one thing learning to be seen from multiple angles. November 3rd. I went to see Gutierrez. I didn't call ahead. I drove to Paulina and walked into the ranger station and found him at his desk eating lunch. He looked startled to see me. "Mara, you okay?" "I need to see the tower log again, and I need the historical records, everything from the 80s and 90s. The staffers who left. I need their contact information if you have it." He put down his sandwich, studied me for a long time. Then he said, "Sit down." He closed the office door. He pulled a file drawer and removed a folder, not a thin one, manila, dog-eared, with a hand-written label I couldn't read from my angle. "I was hoping you wouldn't come back," he said. "Why?" "Because the ones who come back are the ones who can't stop looking, and the ones who can't stop looking." He opened the folder. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, printed emails, a few photographs. They keep finding things. He slid a photograph across the desk, black and white, date stamp in the corner, June 1989. It showed a circle of bleached pine needles at the base of a tree, identical to the ones I'd found on the river trail. "Where was this taken?" I asked. "Prinville City Park, 12 miles from the tower. A woman named Deborah Stahl took it. She staffed Kestrel Peak in 88 and 89, left mid-season in August 89, took this photo 3 months later, in town, in a park where she walked her dog." He slid another photo. Color this time. 2004. Same bleached circle, same compression pattern. The background showed a residential backyard, lawn, fence, a children's swing set. Gary Ochoa. Staffed the tower in 03. Found this in his own yard in Redmond. April 04. 7 months after he left the mountain. A third photo. Recent digital high resolution. It showed not one circle, but a cluster of 5, arranged in the grass median of what I recognized as the Highway 97 corridor just south of Bend. Cars visible in the background. "I took that one," Gutierrez said. "Last spring. I wasn't even looking for it. I was driving to a meeting and I saw the white patches from the road." Who else knows about this? Officially, no one. This isn't a file that exists in any system. It's my file. 20 years of collecting things people bring me, people who staffed that tower and couldn't leave it alone afterward. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in him before. Exhaustion. Not physical, temporal. The exhaustion of carrying knowledge for decades. How many? I asked. 11 former lookouts I've spoken with personally. All report the same progression. Shapes on the mountain, then shapes following them down. Bleached circles appearing in populated areas. The pressure, you feel it, don't you? I nodded. They all feel it. It never completely stops. It diminishes over time for most people. Years. But it never fully goes away. He paused. Deborah Stoll still feels it. She's 72, lives in Madras. Says it's just part of her life now. Background noise. What is it? I asked. Gutierrez closed the folder, placed both hands flat on its surface. I don't know. I've had 30 years to think about it, and I don't know. But I'll tell you what I observe. The circles appear more frequently than they used to. In the 90s, it was 1 or 2 a year, always within a few miles of the tower. Now I find them monthly, along highways, in parks, in yards. The range is expanding. Bend, Redmond, Prinville, Madras. Every town on the east slope. Because there are more of us, I said. More former lookouts carrying the pressure. We're not just witnesses. We're anchors, he said. That's my word for it. I think each person who spends time watching them becomes a fixed point they can orient to. A reference marker. Like the landmarks on the Osborne map. And the more reference markers in populated areas, the more precisely they can position themselves among people. I sat with that for a long time. The weight of it, the arithmetic. 11 former lookouts, I said. Plus whoever you don't know about. Plus me. All living in Central Oregon towns. All carrying the pressure. All functioning as a network they navigate by. Yes. And you keep staffing the tower. He took his hands off the folder, looked at the wall. The tower provides fire detection for 180,000 acres of increasingly dry forest. Every year we burn hotter, longer. Every year, early detection saves more lives and more property. I can't decommission it because something strange happens to the people who work there. Even knowing what it does to them afterward. What does it do, Mara? You're sitting here. You're healthy. You're functional. The pressure is uncomfortable but not harmful. The bleached circles are strange, but they've never hurt anyone. The shapes in 30 years, across 11 people, no one has been physically harmed. No one has disappeared. No one has died. They just carry something with them when they leave. You don't know it's not harmful. No, he agreed. I don't know that. But I also don't know what happens if we stop looking. If we take away the tower, the observers, the reference points, maybe it stays in the forest. Or maybe it finds another way to learn, a worse way. At least this way, there's a structure, a known pattern, a progression I can track. I left Paulina with the folder. Gutierrez let me take it. He said he was tired of carrying it alone. That was 3 weeks ago. I've read every page. 11 accounts spanning 4 decades, all describing the same sequence. Shapes in the trees around the tower. Gradual approach, increased duration, eventual departure of the observer. Continued presence of the pressure in populated areas. Bleached circles appearing in the observer's daily environment. But reading them chronologically, I notice what Gutierrez described. Acceleration. The time between tower assignment and first sighting has compressed from months, 1980s, to weeks, 1990s, to days, 2003-2008, to, in my case, 73 days, which at first seems longer, but I realize now that's because I stayed. I didn't leave after the first sighting. I stayed 6 more weeks and gave it sustained professional-grade attention, measured it, logged it, categorized it, and in doing so, I provided it with the most detailed observational template any staffer had ever offered, and Harlan, who arrived after me, saw them in 7 days. The next person will see them immediately. I dream about the tower now. Not nightmares. That's the unsettling part. The dreams are calm, the view, the smell of sun-heated timber, the satisfaction of a clean scan. In the dreams I'm still on station, still watching, still useful. The shapes are there, in the trees, at all distances, and I'm logging them with the same discipline I logged smoke. And it feels right. It feels like the job I was always supposed to be doing, not watching for fire, watching for them, providing the observation they need to resolve themselves into something the rest of the world can perceive. I wake from these dreams with the pressure slightly stronger, and every morning it takes a little longer to convince myself that the ponderosas outside my apartment window are empty. Last Tuesday, November the 19th, I was driving on Century Drive, heading west toward Mount Bachelor. National Forest land on both sides. Dense lodgepole corridor, trees tight to the road. I was doing 55 and I saw peripherally a flash in the passenger window, a shape. Tall, dark, stationary, mid-canopy. I was past it before I could focus, but the pressure spiked so hard I felt it in my wrists. I pulled over, walked back along the shoulder. Found nothing. But 40 yards into the timber, at the base of a lodge pole, a bleached circle. Fresh, the ground still warm, and next to the circle, pressed into the compressed duff, a piece of bark. I picked it up. Ponderosa bark, smooth, old, and on the cambium side, the same concentric circles, the same radial lines, the same compass rose. But this time there were 2 dots, one in the center and one at the edge of the outermost circle at approximately bearing 270. West, the direction I'd been driving. I'm the second dot. I'm on their map now, not as observer, not as teacher, as feature, as landmark. A fixed point in their navigation, a reference they orient by the way I oriented by the trees I could see from the cab. I am to them what the Osborne map was to me, a known position from which all other positions can be calculated. And the thing I can't stop thinking, the thing that wakes me at 3 a.m. and keeps me sitting in the dark, feeling the pressure pulse steadily in my chest, is that I'm not alone on the map. There are 11 other dots. 11 former lookouts scattered across Central Oregon towns. And whatever is navigating by us, whatever is using our positions to triangulate its way into populated space, it has been doing this for 40 years. Patiently, incrementally, adding one reference point every few seasons. Gutierrez asked me what happens if we stop looking, but I think the real question is what happens when there are enough of us. Enough fixed points. Enough dots on the compass rose. When the network of observers becomes dense enough that every point in populated space is within range of a reference marker, then they don't need to stand at the threshold of visibility anymore. Then they can simply be here, fully resolved, seen by everyone, because the geometry of our positions makes invisibility impossible. I counted the dots on the bark. 2. But the outermost circle has space for more those radial lines I thought were bearings, the ones I compared to the graduated ring on the firefinder. I count them now. I count them carefully. There are 23 lines, 11 known former lookouts, me. Gutierrez said the historical records are incomplete. There are staffers he hasn't been able to locate. And next season, whoever climbs those 67 stairs will become another dot within days. 23 lines, 23 positions needed. I don't know how many are already filled. I don't know how close the count is to complete. But every time I feel the pressure spike on the trail, in the grocery store, driving through timber, I think, they're checking, they're confirming my position, making sure I'm still here. Still anchored in the network. And I am. Because where would I go? The pressure follows. The circles appear. The map has already been drawn. I called Deborah Stahl yesterday. The 72-year-old in Madras. 35 years since she left the tower. I asked her if the pressure had changed recently. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "It's louder, the last few weeks. Like it's excited about something." Excited, I repeated. I know how it sounds, but that's the only word. It feels like anticipation, like something is almost finished. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my apartment and felt the pressure in my chest and tried to count backward from 23. I'm still counting. The trees outside my window are perfectly still tonight, even though I can hear wind in the distance. And somewhere in the dark, in the ponderosa bark and the lodgepole stands and the juniper margins of every town on the east slope of the Cascades, something is checking its marks, confirming its geometry, waiting for the last line to fill. I keep the shutters open now. There's no point in closing them. Not because I'm brave, because I understand, finally, that the distinction between watching and being watched was always an illusion. There was only ever one act observation, and it doesn't matter which side of the glass you're on. The Osborne Firefinder is still bolted to the center pedestal on Kestrel Peak. Crosshairs still aligned. Graduated rings still marked in degrees. Waiting for the next pair of eyes to climb those 67 stairs and put a bearing on something in the trees. Whoever it is, they won't have to wait long to see. And they won't understand that the seeing is the point that every clean observation, every precise bearing, every minute spent watching is another coordinate added to a map being drawn in a geometry we were never meant to read. I was a fire lookout. I was good at it, and the thing in the trees was good at learning what good looks like. Now it wears the shape of attention. It lives in the space between seeing and being seen. And there are 23 positions on the compass rose, and the pressure in my chest tonight is louder than it was this morning. Something is almost finished, and I can't stop watching.